Great, thank you, Marina. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining today. I just want to say thank you to Marina and to Charity Village for hosting this webinar and giving us an opportunity to present some of our work. So as Marina said, my name is Adam Jog. I'm a research associate with Imagine Canada. I joined the organization in September 2019, and a good chunk of my time with the organization has been dedicated to working on a particular research project, and that's what I'm here to talk about. This research project concerns the topic of social finance, and for the next 45 minutes or so, I'll be sharing some survey findings that came out of that project, which will be presented in an upcoming research report entitled "Are Charities Ready for Social Finance? Investment Readiness in Canada's Charitable Sector." And I also look forward to any questions that you might have. I just wanted to say a quick word about Imagine Canada for those of you that may not be acquainted. As we can see on the slide here, Imagine Canada is a national bilingual charity that works with and on behalf of Canada's charities, nonprofits, and social entrepreneurs to create an operating environment in which social good can thrive. And there are a number of ways in which Imagine Canada goes about trying to create a more favorable operating environment for these types of organizations. So we advocate for federal policies and practices that build stronger not-for-profit organizations, and we also conduct research on sector-relevant issues to inform and educate our stakeholders. We operate 3 social enterprises that help connect organizations with grantors, provide accreditation for organizational excellence, and also encourage businesses to invest in the community. And we also operate a membership program, which sort of brings together a diverse range of actors from across the country, really to help inform Imagine Canada's advocacy and research initiatives. Here's a quick overview of sort of what I've planned for this presentation. So I will begin by discussing the concept of social finance. So what is it and why does it matter? I will then discuss Imagine Canada's research project and provide some details on the methodology that we used. The bulk of this presentation, though, will be dedicated to some key survey findings. And we can sort of walk through this as a way to build on our understanding of social finance. I will then talk about social finance in Canada, in order to provide a context in which we can start to think about these survey findings and their potential implications. This will be followed by a discussion of, what does this all mean for the question that we captured in the title of our research report, "Are Charities Ready for Social Finance?" And then I will conclude with next steps for social finance in Canada, at least with respect to charities. And I would be remiss if I didn't say something about COVID-19 and what this might mean for our findings. So let's begin by talking about the concept of social finance. And we can start with a definition. What is social finance? In our survey and more generally, we define social finance as an investment that seeks a measurable social, cultural, and/or environmental impact, as well as a financial return for the investor. So this focus on blended value, so the mix of social, cultural, environmental impacts, as well as financial returns, is really what distinguishes social finance from, say, a more traditional approach to investing, which may seek only financial returns. And it's also what distinguishes it from revenue sources that charities are quite familiar with, such as grants and donations. These do not require a financial return. In some respects, the definition of social finance, it depends on the point of view of the actor involved. So the definition I just gave is more focused on the point of view of the investor. It's about the investor's intentionality, their desire to achieve social good with their money. But what does social finance look like from the point of view of charities, let's say? And from the point of view of charities, it may be a bit difficult to see how it is different from more conventional debt instruments, such as a repayable loan offered by a commercial bank. And I think this speaks to a question that is out there, which is, is social finance really different? And I do think that there are some differences, and I think that there are 2 differences that may be more noticeable for charities in particular. So one is that social finance may be easier to access and manage. Features such as lower interest rates and more flexible repayment schedules, these are intended to make it easier for charities and other mission-driven organizations to access and manage debt. And this is indeed one of the attractive aspects of social finance. A kind of second noticeable difference, I think, anyways, is that social finance places emphasis on being able to measure your impact and being able to communicate that impact to potential investors, since part of what investors are investing in is the delivery of social, cultural, and environmental impacts. So it's kind of not surprising to hear that impact measurement is an important aspect of social finance. So why might social finance be relevant for charities? Why is it something that is worth paying attention to? And I can sort of start with a bit of context setting in the sense that we hear that charities operate in an increasingly precarious funding environment, where traditional sources of revenue, such as grants and donations, they're becoming less sustainable for many organizations. So over time, we've seen greater emphasis on contribution agreements, and these tend to be short-term in nature. They do not adequately cover administrative costs, and they often come with burdensome accountability and reporting requirements. And with respect to donations, a report published by Imagine Canada in 2018 entitled 30 Years of Giving in Canada showed that the donor base for charities has been shrinking over past decades. So in addition to these funding challenges, it's also worth pointing out that many of these organizations are facing a simultaneous increase in demand for their services, and this adds to the pressure. So it is sort of this context in which social finance emerges as a source of capital that can help charities diversify their revenues and enhance their financial resilience. And this is an attractive proposition for organizations that are looking for new ways to keep their heads above water. So now that we've briefly discussed the concept of social finance, we can start to talk about Imagine Canada's research project, and then we can sort of move on to some of our findings. So this is a project that I've been involved in for about 9 months now. And it came about through Imagine Canada's connection to the Investment Readiness Program, which launched in June 2019. Imagine Canada is one of 20 plus partners in the Investment Readiness Program, which is a $50 million 2-year program by the Government of Canada designed to build the capacity of social purpose organizations like charities and nonprofits to access capital that will be made available through the Social Finance Fund and other opportunities in Canada's social finance market. And I will talk a bit about the Social Finance Fund later in the presentation. So Imagine Canada received a grant from Employment and Social Development Canada through the Investment Readiness Program to conduct a survey of charities to determine their current readiness to take on social finance investments. So there's unfortunately a lack of data on the readiness of charities, and this is sort of the evidence gap that Imagine Canada is trying to fill. And I think that's what makes the findings in our report kind of exciting in the sense that they shed new light on this topic. And I think they make an important contribution to our current understanding of the social finance landscape, at least with respect to charities. Our project has 2 primary objectives. One is sort of to increase awareness of social finance among charities, and we'll get a sense of the importance of that in a bit. And then the other is to gather and share data that will help all social innovation and social finance actors to work more effectively with charities. A final report will be published by Imagine Canada in August 2020, which will lay out the survey findings in more detail. Let's just take a brief look at the methodology that we use for our research. We conducted an online survey. Invitations to participate in the survey were sent to 5,192 charities from across Canada, and we received a total of 1,018 complete responses. Registered charities with annual revenues of $30,000 or more and that were not religious congregations were considered in scope for our survey. So this means that charities with annual revenues less than $30,000 and charities that are religious congregations were not included. Our contact list was drawn from 2 main sources. So the largest component was a convenience sample drawn from the membership of Imagine Canada and a number of other national umbrella organizations. And the remainder was randomly drawn from the population of in-scope Canadian charities. And just kind of a final point here about the methodology that's quite important. Our survey responses were weighted according to revenue size, subsector, and region in order to account for differences between the survey sample and that population of in-scope Canadian charities. So now that we've talked about our research project and the methodology that we used, we are ready to take a look at some of our survey findings. And I have organized the survey findings into some categories to try to make it a bit easier to follow. So on our survey, we asked charities about their awareness of and opinions about social finance, their demand for social finance and how they would use it, barriers they might face in accessing social finance, what their organizational capacity is in key social finance related domains, and their current financing needs. And more or less, this is sort of the way I've organized these findings here. So we'll first address charities' awareness of social finance and their opinions about it. Then we'll take a look at whether charities want social finance. And, if they are to seek a social finance loan, what are some barriers they would encounter? What do charities think of their abilities and areas of organizational capacity that are important for social finance readiness? And then the last category here is charities' current experience with debt. So we'll take a look at whether they hold debt or not, what types of debt they hold, and how do they use it. So let's begin with awareness and opinions. So on our survey, we asked respondents how familiar they are with the general concept of social finance. And the results indicate that a large number of charities have a low awareness of social finance. So we see here on the slide, 66% of respondents said that they had either never heard of the term social finance prior to their participation in the survey, or that they had heard of the term but are not clear on the details. And then at the other end of the scale, we found that just 2% of respondents said they were extremely familiar with social finance, meaning that they had a deep knowledge of it and how it works, and had a good sense of the implications of social finance for policymakers, investors, and sector organizations. The finding that charities have a low awareness of social finance is not all that surprising. So anecdotally, this resonates with much of what we heard talking with subject matter experts in the area. What may be a bit surprising, however, is the sort of scale of the awareness problem. And I think that this actually raises serious questions about the likelihood for charities to participate in the social finance market in the near future. We also took a look to see if there are charities that are more likely to be aware of social finance. And there are 3 types of charities in particular that really stand out. So the first has to do with annual revenue size. And we see that larger charities are more likely to be aware of social finance. Larger meaning those charities with greater annual revenue. And this is especially the case for charities with annual revenues of $5 million or more. The second has to do with the subsector that charities operate in. And we see that organizations that operate in the grant-making, fundraising, and volunteerism subsector are significantly more likely to be aware of social finance. And conversely, we found that charities that operate in the arts, culture, and recreation subsector are less likely to be familiar with the concept of social finance. Lastly, we noticed that geographic area served by charities is relevant, and awareness of social finance tends to be lower among charities that service smaller geographic areas, with reported familiarity lowest among those charities servicing a neighborhood, city, town, or rural municipality. And in particular, we found that charities that service more than one province or territory are significantly more likely to be familiar with social finance. Kind of switching over to opinions now. Survey respondents were asked whether they agreed or disagreed with a series of statements about social finance, and there were 6 statements in total. And what we find is that charities generally hold positive views of social finance, meaning they were more likely to agree than disagree with the statements presented. And we can take a look at this chart here and just kind of walk through that a bit. So for instance, if we look at the statement at the top of the chart, social finance will give investors a better understanding of charities. We see that 43% of respondents agreed with the statement, while only 9% disagreed. And this large differential between agree and disagree holds for the ideas that social finance is a win-win for investors and charities, that social finance will improve the social and environmental impacts of charities, and that social finance will improve the financial sustainability of charities. Responses are a bit more mixed for the bottom 2 statements on this chart. So they are more split on the statement that investors and charities will share the risks of social finance equally, with 21% agreeing and 19% disagreeing with the statement. And respondents are more split on the statement, social finance will likely crowd out other forms of funding for charities. And we see that 23% disagreed with the statement, while 16% agreed with it. And I sort of just want to comment on a little bit on that last point, as I think it speaks to what I've heard from the sector stakeholders, at least, namely that there is a perception among some charities that social finance will become a substitute for grants and contributions, that it will provide a sort of justification for the government's divestment from grants and contributions in favor of, say, pushing loans, and is also related to another view that pervades some of the sector, that social finance will have a negative impact on philanthropy by encouraging investment over giving. And these results here make me think that these are likely perceptions that will need to be addressed at some point. I think that the results showing generally positive opinions about social finance were a bit surprising for me, and I think I'd always assumed that there would be less favorable opinions about social finance. But I think this makes a bit more sense when we start to look at the relationship between opinions about social finance and awareness of social finance. And when we start to look at that relationship, we start to see that many charities have difficulty forming definitive opinions about social finance. So there's a sizable percentage of respondents that didn't really have an opinion. Between 26% and 35% answered don't know to each of those 6 statements in that chart that I showed you previously. And 22% to 30% said they neither agreed nor disagreed with each statement. Given the low awareness of social finance, it's not surprising that charity leaders have difficulty forming definitive opinions about social finance. And if we dive a bit deeper, we actually do see that there is a statistically significant relationship between awareness of social finance and opinions about social finance. So charities that are more aware of social finance are more likely to have positive opinions about social finance. And this relationship between awareness and opinions has important implications for charities' demand for social finance. And that's what I'm going to turn to next. So I think an important question to ask is whether charities even want social finance in the first place. And so we asked our respondents how likely their organization would be to take a repayable loan made available via social finance. And just a quick note on why we asked about repayable loans. This is primarily for 2 reasons. The first is that repayable loans are the most common type of social finance instrument. And the second is that the institutional structure of charities means that equity investments will not be applicable to them. So anchoring this in the language of repayable loans seemed to be the logical thing to do. So as I said, we asked survey respondents how likely their organization would be to take a repayable loan made available through social finance. And the results of the survey show that there does not appear to be much appetite for social finance loans among charities. So we see that 56% of charities say they are unlikely to take a social finance loan, while only 19% said that they'd be likely to take it. And we can actually break that down even further. So of that 56% that said they'd be unlikely to take a social finance loan, 3/5 said they would be very unlikely to take a social finance loan. And of that 19% that said that they'd be likely to take a social finance loan, 3/5 said that they would be somewhat likely. We also found that there are certain charities that say that their organization would be more likely to take a social finance loan were it made available. And we see that charities with larger annual revenues are significantly more likely to say they would take a social finance loan. And this is especially the case for charities with annual revenues of $5 million or more. So I mentioned before that the low awareness of social finance among charities likely presents challenges for their participation in the social finance market. And this is supported by the survey results, which show that there is a statistically significant relationship between awareness of social finance and likelihood to take a social finance loan, what I'm referring to as the demand for social finance. So charities that are more aware of social finance are more likely to say they would take a social finance loan were it made available. At least this is the case until we factor in opinions about social finance, at which point there is no longer a statistically significant relationship between awareness and demand for social finance. Instead, what we see emerge is a statistically significant relationship between opinions about social finance and the likelihood to take a social finance loan. So kind of generally speaking, charities that hold positive opinions about social finance are significantly more likely to say they would take a social finance loan were it made available. And this relationship between opinions and demand is illustrated in the line graph on the slide. So responses to statements about social finance were combined into an overall score shown here on the x-axis, so the 0 to 40. Higher scores represent more positive opinions about social finance, and lower scores represent less positive opinions. So we see as scores increase, the probability that respondents would say that they would take a social finance loan increases, while the probability that respondents would say that they would be unlikely to take a social finance loan decreases. It is important to note that although awareness is not a direct driver of demand for social finance, it may be an indirect driver through its effects on opinions about social finance. Recall from before that I had said that the charities with greater awareness of social finance are more likely to hold positive opinions about social finance. The relationships between these 3 variables can be a bit confusing. for sure. And so I've tried to capture it with this smart art illustration. So essentially, what we're proposing is that we see greater awareness of social finance, driving positive opinions about social finance, which in turn drives greater demand for a social finance loan. And so that sort of, I think, encapsulates the relationships between those variables really well. So we've just seen that many charities are not interested in taking a social finance loan. But if they were to seek a social finance loan, what barriers might they encounter? And that brings us to the current category of results, barriers. We asked charities to select barriers that their organization would encounter if they were to seek a repayable loan made available through social finance. And this chart here shows us what our respondents said. And we see that some of the most commonly selected barriers, those at the top, are financial in nature. So we have a quarter of respondents saying that they're not currently involved in earned income activities, and this would be a barrier. 23% said uncertainty about ability to repay a loan would be a barrier, and 19% said that a lack of assets for loan security would be a barrier. And I think these stand out to me as particularly challenging barriers, given that the ability to attract and repay investments, I think depends in large part on having assets that can be used as collateral to obtain a loan, or being able to generate revenues that can be used to pay back investors. So looking at this, I get the sense that at least a fifth to a quarter of charities say this would be challenging to do. At the bottom of the chart, that very bottom bar, the gray bar, we see that the percentage of respondents that selected don't know is sizable, with 23% of respondents saying that they don't know what barriers they would face. And again, sort of given the low awareness of social finance, I don't think this is particularly surprising that many charities do not know what barriers they would face if they were to seek a social finance loan. And kind of one last comment on this topic of barriers. We see that 23% of respondents said that their board would not consider or approve of a social finance loan. So the risk aversion of charity boards is something that we heard about consistently in talking with subject matter experts and then kind of taking a look at the literature. And our results seem to support this. And when talking about readiness for social finance, the organization's governance structure, specifically the board, has sort of been singled out as a really important component of that. And this is sort of just a slide to kind of reiterate some of those points that I just made in reference to that chart on the last slide. With our survey, we also wanted to look at organizational capacity, as we thought that might tell us a lot about whether charities would be ready for social finance or not. So we looked at the literature sources and took note of the attributes or characteristics that were said to be associated with readiness. We also looked at due diligence guides to understand what impact investors were looking for when they evaluate an organization to decide whether an investment is worthwhile. And we also looked at self-assessment readiness tools. So we took all of this material and we synthesized it into 5 domains of organizational capacity that we felt were relevant for social finance readiness. And these 5 domains are measurement and evaluation, planning and program development, financial, management and governance, and operations and infrastructure. And I just want to briefly walk through each of these domains and provide a bit of a summary of what they are. So starting with measurement and evaluation, this can sort of be summed up as the ability to collect, evaluate, and communicate impact. Planning and program development. So this can be summed up as the ability to develop and improve programs or activities that have impact and that fit within the organization's strategic framework. Looking at the financial domain, this can be summed up as the ability to raise revenues and draw on existing assets to access and repay investments. Now taking a look at management and governance, this perhaps can be summed up as the ability for the board and senior leaders of an organization to take informed risks and to manage staff effectively towards impact. And lastly, looking at operations and infrastructure, this could be summed up as the ability to draw on organizational processes, policies, procedures, as well as stakeholder relationships, technical expertise, and physical assets in order to carry out work effectively. And to kind of just reiterate, so what we're suggesting here is that these 5 capacity domains contribute to an organization's readiness for social finance. So on our survey, we asked 25 questions in total about organizational abilities that fall under these 5 domains. and survey respondents were asked to rate each organizational ability as to whether it is a weakness or a strength for their organization. And the results showed that the overwhelming majority of respondents, generally speaking, rated each ability as a strength rather than a weakness. We do see, however, though, that charities tend to express more doubts about their capacity in the measurement and evaluation domain and in the financial domain compared to the other three. The relative weakness of measurement and evaluation abilities is consistent with the literature. A survey report published by Imagine Canada in 2019, looking at the state of evaluation in the charitable sector, finds that charities are most likely to evaluate their outputs, outcomes, and quality, and less likely to evaluate their impact and return on investment. And there are also numerous publications identifying significant challenges with respect to impact measurement in the sector, such as poor data quality, lack of technical skill sets needed to work with data, and the lack of access to data needed to measure impact. Those are some challenges of many. And impact measurement has also been identified as a considerable barrier to charities' participation in the social finance market. Our results show that 34% of respondents rated their ability to collect evaluation data as a weakness, and 32% of respondents rated their ability to assess the social environmental impact of their work as a weakness. And both of these abilities actually fall in the top 5 most reported weaknesses. The relative weakness of financial abilities makes sense given the precarious funding environment that charities find themselves in. In particular, 41% of respondents rated their ability to raise unrestricted funds when needed as a weakness, and 35% rated their ability to draw on a diverse range of revenue sources as a weakness. Just kind of a final note here on organizational capacity. We were curious to see if there was a relationship, or if there were relationships between organizational capacity and some of the other variables of interest for us. And while organizational capacity does vary significantly according to a variety of factors, what was most marked was the size of charities' annual revenues. And this was the case across each of the 5 domains. So what we see is that charities with greater annual revenues are more likely to report their capacity as strong compared to charities with smaller annual revenues. We can now turn to look at charities' experience with debt. And the sort of assumption behind asking charities about this is that past and present behavior might be able to tell us something about how they may behave in the future. So we asked respondents whether they currently hold any type of debt or financial obligation. And the results show that 50% of charities currently hold debt, whereas 48% do not. So kind of right off the bat, it's a sizable percentage of charities that do not currently hold any debt. And when it comes to charities that are more likely to currently hold debt, we see again the sort of importance of the size of charities' annual revenue. So charities with greater annual revenues are more likely to hold debt. And when we look at that 50% of charities that do currently hold debt, we can sort of break it down to see what types of debt that they hold. And we find that the most common types of debt are related to day-to-day operations. So at the very top, we see 38% of respondents hold organizational credit cards. We see 22% hold a building lease, 18% hold a material or equipment lease, and 13% hold an organizational line of credit. And then we see 6% for term loans, and 3% for trade credit from suppliers, and 6% other debt or obligation. And it is actually the case that a majority of charities do use that debt for operational purposes. And we know this because we asked them the reasons that they had acquired the debt. And the results are visible on the present slide here. So we see that a quarter of charities said they use their debt for financing day-to-day operations. 15% said they would use it to improve existing programs or services. And the figure is actually larger than this. So we see at the bottom there, 28% of respondents selected other type of debt or financial obligation. And those that did, many of them followed up with sort of a text response. The overwhelming majority of these responses indicate that debt is used for operational purposes. So many respondents reported that they had acquired debt to make purchases, such as office supplies or equipment like printers. And many said that they had acquired this debt to pay expenses on a daily or monthly basis. And a lot of them often noted how It was just a more convenient way of doing so. So for those charities that currently hold some type of debt, we know the reasons why they acquired it, and we know how they're using it. But we were also curious to know how charities would use a social finance loan if they were to take one. And the responses suggest that the proposed uses for a social finance loan would be quite different in some cases from how charities are currently using their debt. So looking at programs and services, we can see that charities are almost 3 times more likely to say they would use a social finance loan to develop new programs and services. And they're almost 2.5 times more likely to say that they would use a social finance loan to expand or improve existing programs and services. Looking at developing or enhancing revenue streams, we see that charities are 5.5 times more likely to say they would use a social finance loan to develop or enhance revenue streams compared to how charities currently use debt. And then kind of a final, another kind of major difference, this is the final one for this presentation, had to do with human capital purposes. So hiring new staff or training existing staff. And respondents that currently hold debt, they rarely acquire it for the purposes of improving their human capital, either by hiring new staff or training existing staff. But when we look at how charities say they would use a social finance loan, we see that charities are 24 times more likely to say they would use a social finance loan to hire new staff, and are almost 12 times more likely to say they would use a social finance loan to train existing staff. So there are some kind of noticeable differences in terms of how charities that currently hold debt use that debt versus how charities said that they would use a social finance loan. We wanted to see if there was any relationship between holding debt and the demand for a social finance loan, given that one of our assumptions for looking at debt experience in the first place was that it may be predictive of future behavior. So when we look at this relationship, we do see that charities that hold either term loans, trade credit from suppliers, or some other debt or financial obligation are significantly more likely to say they would take a social finance loan. So for instance, just focusing on term loans, 72% of charities that hold term loans say their organization would be more likely to take a social finance loan compared to 19% of charities that do not currently hold term loans. And it's worth noting here that none of the other debt types are significantly correlated with the likelihood of taking a social finance loan. So for instance, organizational credit cards, leases, organizational lines of credit were not found to be significantly correlated with demand for social finance. Given that the sort of relationship between currently held debt types and demand for social finance, given that relationship is strongest for those charities that hold term loans, and given that the survey question about demand had asked respondents how likely their organization would be to take a repayable loan, one possible inference from these findings is that charities that have experience with one type of debt may be more favorable to acquiring the same type or maybe a similar type of debt in the future. This is sort of just one interpretation of many, I'm sure. I'm sure there's other possible interpretations. And that sort of concludes our survey findings. And having gone through them, I will now talk a bit about the social finance market in Canada in order to provide a bit of context in which we can situate those findings and start to think about what they mean. And in a very abstract way, to start with, we can talk about the social finance market as being comprised of 3 components. So on the far left, we have the demand side, far right, we have the supply side, and then sort of in the middle, we have the intermediaries. The demand side would include investees, so those organizations that are seeking social finance. And examples of types of organizations that might be seeking social finance are, for instance, social purpose organizations, so charities, nonprofits, cooperatives, and for-profit social enterprises. The supply side would include the investors. They are providing social finance for investees. And there can be many different types of investors, and some of those are listed here in the visual on the slide. And then in the middle, there are the intermediaries, and their role is to facilitate transactions between the demand and supply side, kind of connecting them together. And as was the case with social finance investors, there are many different kinds of intermediaries too, and some of those are listed in this visual here. Now, kind of talking about it a bit more concretely, the social finance market in Canada is in its early stages, but there are indications that it is growing. So a 2019 report from the Responsible Investment Association looks at the growth of impact investments in Canada. And for the purposes of this presentation, impact investments can be considered a subset of social finance. And their report shows that in 2018, there was a total of $14.75 billion in assets intended for impact investments in Canada. And this figure is nearly double of what was available just 2 years prior, which was $8.15 billion. So there's growth for sure, and then kind of more recently, the government of Canada has made moves to sort of catalyze Canada's social finance market, primarily through the establishment of a social finance fund and an associated investment readiness program, which I sort of talked about a bit before when talking about our project. So the social finance fund, just to provide a bit of detail about that. The social finance fund is a $755 million investment by the government of Canada to provide social purpose organizations with affordable, repayable capital. Essentially, the fund is a pool of money that will increase the amount of capital available for charities, nonprofits, cooperatives, for-profit social enterprises, organizations like this. The Social Finance Fund actually originates from a recommendation by a social innovation social finance co-creation steering group that was appointed by the government of Canada in 2018 for the purpose of informing the development of a national social innovation social finance strategy. That group had noted in its report, which was released in the summer of 2019, that social purpose organizations faced many challenges to accessing capital. And so the creation of the Social Finance Fund is sort of one step that's meant to address that kind of capital gap. And so the money that's available that will be made available through the Social Finance Fund, it's intended to help these social purpose organizations to create and grow innovative programs and initiatives that are aimed at kind of solving the most persistent and complex social, cultural, and environmental challenges in our society. I think a big challenge for the success of the Social Finance Fund and the market more generally is whether the demand side has the capacity to absorb all of the capital that's going to be made available. Are social purpose organizations going to be able to access it? And I think a key lesson from the United Kingdom's experience with social finance funds is that the lack of readiness on the demand side was a major obstacle to the growth of the UK social finance market. And similar concerns have been raised about Canada's social finance market, in particular the notion that the existing pipeline of investable projects or organizations is insufficient to meet the supply of capital that does exist. And I think this sort of leads us back to kind of our main question, which is, are charities ready for social finance? And I think a logical place to start is with the definition of investment readiness. And I think I said before that investment readiness is generally defined as the ability to attract and repay an investment. And often the focus is on a set of key characteristics or attributes that contribute to this ability. But what are these key characteristics or attributes? And I think this is where it gets a bit tricky to pin down the concept of investment readiness, mostly because, at least in my estimation, it seems to be a case-specific determination. And in some respects, determinations of investment readiness seem to be highly subjective. So charities, social finance intermediaries, and investors may all hold differing assessments about the investment readiness of an organization. So different weights might be placed on different characteristics or attributes as sort of being indicative of readiness. But in an effort to provide an answer to the question of whether charities are ready for social finance, I will sort of nonetheless try to apply the label in a more general way. And with a sort of fairly broad formulation of the concept of investment readiness in mind, our survey results suggest that many charities are not investment ready. And why do I say this? And we can sort of tread back through some of the survey findings that we've just seen. So for instance, a large number of charities are not aware of social finance. Many charities do not know what to think of when presented with opinion statements about the implications of social finance for charities. A majority of charities are not interested in taking a social finance loan. Charities tend to be more doubtful about abilities critical for social finance readiness. So we saw the relative weakness in terms of measurement and evaluation abilities and financial abilities. Potential barriers to seeking a social finance loan selected by many charities concern key aspects of investment readiness. So saw generating earned income, the ability to pay back a loan, and board buy-in for social finance. All of these things were center points of barriers. And then also almost half of charities do not currently hold debt. And those that do are less likely to hold those types of debt that were significantly associated with a greater likelihood of taking a social finance loan. So for instance, term loans. Term loans are significantly, or I should say charities that hold term loans are significantly associated with the likelihood to take a social finance loan. But of the charities that currently hold debt, I think term loans comprise like 6% of that figure. What we do see though is, although it appears that many charities are not ready, the results do point towards a subset of charities that are likely ready or close to it, those with larger annual revenues. And we sort of saw this across the results that we just went over. So our survey found that charities with larger annual revenues are more likely to be aware of and hold positive opinions about social finance, take a social finance loan where made available, currently hold debt, specifically term loans, and report stronger organizational capacity. So sort of what now, this sort of slide here, what now, COVID and beyond. The survey results presented in this report support claims made, I think, that the existing pipeline of investable projects or organizations is insufficient, at least in the near term, to meet the supply of capital that does exist in Canada. The results suggest that work is still needed to build demand for social finance among charities, building awareness of and interest in and capacity for social finance among a broader range of charities and not just limiting involvement to larger charities. I think that this could contribute to the development of a more inclusive and diverse market that would address a wider variety of social, cultural, and environmental challenges. And I just wanted to say a quick word about COVID-19. So we conducted our survey over a roughly 2-month period between January 22nd and March 15th of this year. And this period of data collection, it largely precedes the outbreak of COVID-19 and its associated effects on Canada's charitable nonprofit sector. I think the lockdown came in mid-March. And so with that, we sort of have a snapshot of charities on this topic prior to COVID, but we don't really know what has changed since. And I think it's interesting to sort of think about what COVID means for our survey results. I said before that many charities are not investment ready, and my suspicion is that charities are less ready as a result of COVID-19. The impact on the charitable sector has been devastating, and it would sort of be hard for me to imagine that this hasn't negatively impacted their readiness for social finance. But the case is we just don't really know. And so that would be sort of an interesting area to explore. And that sort of concludes my presentation. And I just want to say thank you so much for attending and taking the time to listen today. If you need to contact me, I put my email address up here. On the right-hand side of the slide, there are some Imagine Canada's contact details. And then just 2 quick points. You can sign up early to receive our research report that will be released in August. So that's the second link there. It directs you to a page where you can click a button. You'll sort of be added to a list, and you'll receive a digital copy of the report in August when it's released. And then the last kind of point there is you can also sign up to receive our early alert newsletter. And this provides social finance related news and also any sort of updates about the investment readiness program or the social finance fund. And with that, I sort of conclude my presentation and I turn it back over to Marina.
That's great, Adam. Thank you so much. And thanks to everyone who is putting in all your questions. We've got lots and lots of questions coming in. We're not going to be able to get to all of them. So do follow up with Adam afterwards if we don't get to your question. He's very generously provided his email address there for you to reach out to him directly. So let's start. Adam, do you have any examples of what social finance actually looks like in action and what forms are most popular?
Well, I would say in terms of what forms of social finance are most popular, if I understand the question correctly, I do think it is, at least in terms of what we looked at, it would be some type of debt instrument, mostly repayable loans. Those, at least in terms of the literature that I read, that seems to be the most common type of social finance. And I unfortunately do not have any sort of ready examples at hand of how charities have used social finance. Although I do think that is a really good way for people to start to get into understanding the topic a bit more. So on our survey, actually, when we had a final question, which was asking respondents, now that you've taken the survey, is there anything else that you would like to say or like to ask, I guess? And you look at those responses, and a lot of respondents were saying that what would be really helpful are concrete examples of how social finance has been used by charities. What are some of the pros and cons? What are some of the benefits, risks? And so I think that is a really good way to get at the topic of social finance. Unfortunately, in the report, it was mostly focused on the survey results. We didn't have a chance to bring in sort of, but if you would like to send me an email, I'd be happy to dig through dig up some sort of examples, and I can provide those with you. That would be a benefit.
That's great. That sounds like it probably answers another question that we had, which is, what do you think the barrier to awareness might be? And it sounds like one of those barriers might actually be understanding how it works in practice with some case studies.
Yeah, for sure. I think I would say social finance, my understanding of social finance is that it's been around for a while, although it's a particularly niche subject area. Even though I understand there's a lot of growing interest in it and a lot more applications around it, but it's a relatively niche subject area, and it's a bit amorphous. It's a bit hard to sort of really get to understand concretely how it is different from things that already exist. And I think that's going to be a major challenge moving forward, is to be able to find a way to sort of communicate social finance and its value in very practical terms. I know for me too, kind of a personal kind of note, my sort of introduction to the topic of social finance really began at the end of September last year when I joined Imagine Canada to work on this project. And so, before that, I wasn't really aware of the topic of social finance, and I still have a great deal to learn. But I do think that I do understand that there are a lot of difficulties when it comes to awareness, and I think the language that's used to talk about social finance can be a problem. There's a lot of jargon that's used, and that can be a bit difficult to follow. It can be a bit I don't know if technocratic is the right word, but a bit technical, I think, too technical, and that can be a turnoff, I think, for many.
Well, on that note, we actually had some questions about language, and I'm wondering if you have heard the terms innovative finance or outcomes purchasing, and how that intersects with social finance.
I've heard, and I could be incorrect about this. I've heard about outcomes purchasing. I always think about it in terms of outcomes-based funding, and I sort of don't know if that's the same sort of concept as what's captured by outcomes purchasing. But it's sort of, and I think, at least bringing it into the realm of social finance again, I think social impact bonds, I think they might be considered a form of outcomes-based funding. That's also considered a type of social finance. I hope I'm not getting that incorrect, but essentially it's bringing a private sector partner, a private investor into the mix in order to finance kind of more innovative programs or services delivered by a charitable organization or nonprofit. And sort of the idea is that upon the attainment of certain outcomes, that private investor would be sort of awarded the sort of difference that results in cost savings that accrue to the government. So I think social impact bonds would be one example of a sort of outcomes-based funding kind of mechanism that sort of falls within the domain of social finance. And innovative financing, to be quite honest, I'm not too sure that I've heard that term before, but that doesn't mean that means I should probably just look into it after this webinar.
It does sound like there's a lot of different terminology. That's probably another barrier right there. Okay,
Yeah, sure.
so now, are you aware of any research that might have been done about charities who have used it and what their experience might be with it, and whether they found it useful? And then sort of piggybacking on that, we've had a lot of questions about what a typical interest rate or average loan amount might look like.
I'm not able to speak to average loan amounts or interest rates, but in terms of research, I think an interesting report that comes to mind is a report, I think it was commissioned by the Metcalf Foundation, and I think it might have been in 2018, but it's a report looking at social finance in the arts and culture subsector, and I forget the title. I think it's maybe something like More Than Money, and it's sort of an examination of social finance in the arts sector and kind of the challenges and opportunities for that. And I know that report provides some good examples of how social finance has been used, and it talks about some of the benefits and maybe some of the drawbacks as well. And if I recall, I was looking through that report, there was a mention of sort of I think it was like some sort of social finance fund maybe that was set up in the UK, and it provides a whole whack of like case studies of organizations that have accessed it and used it. I wish I could remember the name of that fund, but again, if you wanted to send me an email, I'd be happy to dig that up for you.
That's great, and I actually just popped a link to the Metcalf Foundation report in the chat box, so feel free to check that out. Adam, is social finance generally only available to charities, or is it open to nonprofits as well?
It would be open to nonprofits as well. So the sort of the phraseology that's used with respect to the investment readiness program and the social finance fund is kind of social purpose organizations. And so these are really any organizations that have, say, like a social, cultural, or environmental mission at their core. And it's often talked about in terms of, as examples of social purpose organizations, it's often talked about in terms of charities, nonprofits, cooperatives, and for-profit social enterprises. So social finance is something that would be available to nonprofits. And I know with respect to the investment readiness program, there is a look at sort of whether charities or I guess organizations, social purpose organizations more generally, whether there are currently generating any sort of income from the sales of goods and services, or whether they have the intention to. So I think that sort of that earned income aspect would be an important characteristic of organizations for which social finance might be applicable. So to answer the question kind of more directly, yes, to my knowledge, nonprofits would be sort of, it would be something that social finance would be, that they could take advantage of.
Great. Well, I see we're coming up on the top of the hour here, so I think we're going to call it a day in terms of questions. Adam, did you have any final comments before we sign off?
No, other than to say thank you again, Marina, and to Charity Village for hosting the webinar and letting us share some of our work. I really appreciate it, and thank you to everyone who attended.
Well, thank you, Adam, for giving us a sneak peek of these survey findings. I do want to remind everyone we'll follow up with you by email this afternoon with the webinar recording, the slide deck. We'll also include the link to sign up for receiving the report, the full report, when it is published. There will also be a short survey that will take less than 5 minutes to fill out. I hope you'll complete that for us if you can. There is an opportunity there to let us know if there's other topics you'd like to see covered in the future, and we'll share the feedback with Adam as well. I'd like to remind you all that Charity Village has many resources available to you, including our dedicated COVID-19 resource page. Our job postings are currently available at a 15% discount, and you can also access a $10 discount on our online courses. Those discount codes are included on that COVID-19 resource page, and we will include a link to that in the follow-up email that we send out later today. Additionally, you can visit our site to post free volunteer and event listings. That's for virtual events as well. And of course, you can browse all of our articles, webinar recordings, and listen to our weekly podcast. On behalf of Charity Village, thank you very much for joining us today. Our next free webinar will be held on Thursday, July 9th. We'll be discussing how leaders can improve employee engagement and innovation. And we'll include a link in the email that we send out later today in case you would like to register for that. Thank you all again for taking part in today's webinar. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye-bye.